Hello. I would like to welcome everybody to episode number 6 of the Gspröch, a podcast that focuses exclusively on the global institutional adoption of crypto and digital assets, and brought to you by the leader in institutional digital asset trading technology, Wyden. My name is Stuart Peterson and the host of the Gspröch, and on today's show, I'm very excited to welcome the following two guests, Mariane Kondo and Paulo Branca. Mariane and Paulo are both partners at Mattos Filho, a full-service law firm recognized as Brazilian Law Firm of the Year for several years now, including this year by Chambers Brazil Awards. Along with her asset management expertise, Mariane advises her clients looking into making investments and design strategies for developing their businesses with crypto assets and providing strategic advice on complying with applicable Brazilian legal and regulatory requirements. Paulo is a distinguished professor at Pontificia Universidade Católica de São Paulo and a graduate and postgraduate professor in business law and law and technology at the same institution. He specializes in technology, banking, financial services, crypto assets, and innovation issues. So maybe I could hand over to both you, Mariane, and Paulo to give an introduction to yourselves and the great work that you and your colleagues do at Mattos Filho.
Hi, Stuart. Thanks for having me. My name is Mariane, and as you mentioned, I'm one of the partners of the crypto assets teams at Mattos Filho in Brazil. And before we start, I think it's important to highlight that our practice combines professionals of different areas of expertise to provide a multidisciplinary approach to this matter. So even though I have a capital markets background, in the last 15 years, I have been focused in advising clients in relation to investment funds and asset managers related matters, including the formation of crypto asset funds. And I work as a foreign associate in New York and Cayman Island, and it's a great pleasure to be here today talking with you.
Thank you very much, Mariane, and over to you, Paulo.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to work in this firm. As you mentioned, it's a full-service law firm, and as Mariane explained, in the crypto practice, we join efforts not only in the regulatory scenario, which is one of my fields of expertise, as I work with banking, fintechs in different specific situations that they need our advice. But when it comes to crypto, our firm joined a number of people specialized in their specific fields of activity, such as tax, compliance, and even criminal law, not to say other fields such as corporate M&A, as there are many opportunities going on in Brazil. So for sure, any client that we have has the opportunity to be full service in its needs in relation to crypto.
That's great. And thank you very much for the introductions, Mariane and Paulo. And maybe I could kick off and commence by asking that, given that the Brazilian authorities are currently in the process of developing the new regulations, could you please provide a brief overview of the developments to date and the current status of the regulation?
Sure. I can start talking about the Brazilian virtual asset law and the regulation enacted by the Brazilian Securities and Exchange Commission. And then Paulo can provide you the current scenario of the Brazilian Central Bank regulation. So last year was an important year for the virtual asset industry in Brazil, because in June 2023 came into effect the Brazilian virtual asset law. In general terms, such law established principles and guidelines for the provision of virtual asset service providers and the operation of the so-called CASPs and CASPs, right? According to this law, the provision and regulation of virtual asset services will have to comply, among other things, with good governance practices, risk-based approach, personal data protection, user protection, and prevention of money laundering. The law does not designate a specific entity responsible for regulating the matter. However, it indicates that the Brazilian government will be required to appoint one or more administrative bodies for this. Although there is no express provision on that, there is a real expectation that this entity will be the Brazilian Central Bank. An important note here is that the law does not apply to virtual assets representing securities in Brazil. Given that securities are already regulated by the Brazilian Securities and Exchange Commission, right? On that topic, virtual assets can be considered securities when they digitally represent securities or when they fall into the concept of collective investment contracts, which we will discuss in further details during our conversation. Efforts to raise funds from the general public in Brazil shall also be analyzed on a case-by-case scenario, because it's very tricky. And before we jump into the Brazilian Central Bank regulation, I think on the investment fund side, we also had a big improvement, which is important to mention here. In December 2022, the Brazilian SEC enacted the new regulatory framework for investment funds. And for the first time, crypto assets came to be considered a proper financial asset in Brazil. The Brazilian Financial and Capital Markets Association, which is called ANBIMA in Brazil, it's a self-regulatory body for the capital markets in Brazil, also announced specific rules and procedures for the asset managers in Brazil to invest in crypto assets, focus on good practice and transparency to the investors and the market. And now I will let Paulo talk about the Brazilian Central Bank scenario.
Thank you.
Sure. And as you explained it in the beginning, back in 2022, more specifically on December 2022, the Congress has approved and the President has enacted the law 14478, which is the virtual asset law. And as Mariane explained it, there was no specific indication of who should be the regulator. And then on June of 2023, the President has issued a decree, and I'll just mention the number here for reference, 11563, which has appointed the Brazilian Central Bank as one of the regulator, or the main regulator, for the aspects involving authorization, oversight, and other specific matters involving the virtual asset service providers. Now, when the central bank was then appointed as the regulator, it was a kind of a new reaction from the central bank, in the sense that, look, this is a completely new field. Of course, they do not express it as I'm going to do here. But the idea that they expressed was, as this is a completely new field, I'm not sure how I'm going to regulate. And then on December 2023, it opened a public consultation, more specifically asking to the society how crypto, not specifically crypto, but virtual asset service providers should be regulated. This public consultation lasted up to January of 2024, and it comprised some important themes so the society in general could bring their ideas on how to regulate. So the matters in discussion were asset segregation and risk management. The central bank wanted to understand if assets involving crypto should or not be segregated. The activities to be developed by the VASPs and how to trade virtual assets is some of the aspects it wanted to understand. Contracting involving essential services, such as the custody or intermediaries, wallet service, how this should be regulated, how governance and conduct rules also should be addressed by the central bank, cybersecurity, for sure, client protection, and rules of transition involving the non-regulated environment to a regulated environment. So the central bank received a good number of opinions, and then it is expected they will provide with the first draft of the regulation on October 2024. This is what they have informally mentioned, and we are expecting. Up to that moment, we just have thoughts on how the central bank is going to regulate. So this first draft is really being expected by the players.
And that's really interesting, both in terms of the central bank, who's going to regulate, when it's planned to regulate, what some of the impacts are for not just banks, but also for the buy-side community and for collective investment funds. So I think that's a really great feedback that you provided for the listeners today. But maybe I could then move to the sort of next question is, based upon your areas of expertise in the Brazilian markets, what do you think are or maybe have been the main drivers for the Brazilian authorities to create regulation specific to digital assets? Clearly, we've seen this in different jurisdictions, like in MiCA for the EU, the DLT and Blockchain Act in Switzerland, the new regulations in Turkey, South Africa. But what do you think has been specific to Brazil?
Right, I can start. I think one important aspect to consider is the scope of this regulation. It relates to service providers, not to crypto itself. So it's not a law that's going to regulate crypto, as Mariane was explaining. There's a concern involving the configuration of security, but the law makes it clear that this type of matter is not addressed in the virtual assets law. So by regulating service providers, it was a way for the Congress to address, I think, two specific situations that were very important in the moment of the discussion of this law. The first one, it was and it's still, there is a great concern involving Ponzi schemes with crypto. In Brazil, it's very common to have people, jumping into innovation involving financial opportunities, crypto, it was not different. So the lack of regulation, the lack of controls, the lack of transparency on what is crypto and how this type of service should be provided was one of the aspects that the Congress showed its concern, and a good number of articles contained in the law is addressed to this type of protection. The other aspect, and I think this is a worldwide concern, is money laundering, not only in national perspective, but an international perspective for sure, as we know that crypto is one of the tools that is used for crime, for illegal activities. And by regulating VASPs, at least the Congress intends to at least try to reduce the way money laundering use crypto assets to develop its activities. I don't know, Mariane, if you want to jump in and add some ideas as well.
Yeah, I would just add that from a Brazilian SEC perspective, in case the service provider wants to be an asset manager in Brazil, this is a regulated activity in Brazil. So it must be registered with the Brazilian SEC as any other asset manager, and will be supervised by the Brazilian SEC, has all the responsibilities of any other asset manager, such as reporting, transparency, fiduciary duties before the client and everything. So we saw a lot of service providers coming to Brazil to provide different type of services, but in case they want to do something that is regulated in Brazil, they need to provide and they need to be registered and they need to comply with the current regulation.
Thank you for that. I think that we're seeing this in other jurisdictions as well. So I think we're seeing almost slight globalization, which is a good thing, and homogeneity in terms of regulation coming in either as a CASP or a VASP. So I think that's thank you very much. That I'm sure they're well received, the considerations and comments to our listeners today. But maybe if you could maybe outline some of the major areas you see that the authorities are currently considering the scope of the regulation, and maybe are there differences between regulation for the buy side, which is more about funds where there's an investment into a collective investment scheme, whether that's a mutual fund or a long only fund, or even maybe an ETF or an ETP, versus on the sell side with banks, where generally banks are looking at offering retail buy, sell, hold, closed loop services, or maybe even institutional or prime brokerage services.
Okay. What I think we can say, there are three main lines of this regulation where central bank will oversee the activities involving the service providers. I think we can say financial capacity, internal controls, and responsibility. In terms of financial capacity, there's a reason why the central bank, in accordance with the law, will grant a prior authorization to operate as a VASPs. So it's something that demonstrates that the VASPs will need to show its technical and financial capacity to operate in this market. And whenever there is a requirement for authorization within a Brazilian central bank procedure, the central bank requests lots of information, the way it's going to provide services, its business model, a lot of information that is required for the central bank to understand that it has financial capacity, it knows what it's going to do, and it's fine in granting the authorization. And these financial capacity is not only for the operator, but it's common for the central bank to request information up to the ultimate beneficial owner, which in accordance to our laws will be the final responsible, and I mean final financial responsible for the good standing of the authorized entity. So this is something that will probably be considered in this regulation. When it comes to internal controls, we have already a good number of AML-FT rules, not only applicable to financial institutions, but also for payment institutions. And it's probably going to be replied for the VASPs. And also what I think is one of the key concerns involving the anonymity of the crypto environment. And then I think rules regarding know your customer, know your employee, know your partner, know your supplier will be probably part of this regulation and how these will need to develop their internal controls. And the other aspect, which is the responsibility of the service providers, will probably concentrate in cybersecurity for obvious reasons, data protection as well as something that is being very well developed in Brazil, and in this environment is not going to be different. And of course, rules involving the custody of virtual assets when it's important as a decentralized system, as blockchain, entities shall be responsible for the custody of the virtual asset, and what will be the rules applicable to that will be also something to see.
Yeah, and from the buy side, I think it's important to highlight that the Brazilian SEC and ANBIMA, the self-regulatory entity that I mentioned before, they already issued a regulation regarding the investment funds who wants to invest in crypto assets and digital assets, including ETFs, including mutual funds and hedge funds or any other type of fund. So I would say that they have the same type of concern that Paulo mentioned. So we have seen some rules regarding risk factors, transparency to investors, make sure the AML rules are in compliance, and this type of concern, I would say. But for this type of fund, we already have in place the regulation for that.
Thank you for clarifying that, Mariane. That's excellent. But maybe if I can just then pivot to maybe sort of, not a hypothetical point, but let's just say I'm an executive at a Brazilian bank or broker, and I want to branch out into offering digital asset services, or hopefully Brazil's going to get a lot of external international investment. So I'm now an offshore virtual asset service provider who wants to set up in Brazil. What are the kind of key timelines that I should be looking out for in terms of regulation and compliance, and what do I need to do by when?
That's a very good question, Stu, because advertisement in Brazil is always a challenge. I would say I will start here and then Paulo can complement, but as a general rule, no public offerings in Brazil of any kind of securities may occur without prior registration with the Brazilian SEC. So we have a lot of concerns in that respect. The SEC guidance indicates that crypto assets can be considered securities when they digitally represent securities, as I mentioned before, or when they fall into the concept of collect investment contracts. And they have to follow certain requirements, such as the nature of the investment, the expected economic benefit, if they are doing through an effort to raise money from the public, for instance, from general public especially. And we've tried to follow the same thing, the same rationale that they have in the U.S., the U.S. Supreme Court interpretation of how we test for the collective investment. So it's almost the same what we do in Brazil. But it is quite common nowadays to see public advertisement to invest in crypto assets with promise of significant returns in Brazil. We definitely do not recommend that, even though the VASP or the asset is located outside Brazil in a jurisdiction other than Brazil. Besides that, I think it's important for us to establish that we have a rule in Brazil in place for public offering, and that regulation established a safe harbor. And the safe harbors it's for securities issued and listed in other jurisdictions that are not subject to a registration in the Brazilian with the Brazilian Securities Commission, but provided that certain requirements are met, such as the securities are exclusively marketed to and sold to professional investors in Brazil, and professional investors are institutional investors, individual and corporate entities that have more than 10 million reais invested in the financial and capital markets, for instance, which in turn invest in such securities through foreign account with offshore money, ou seja, settle offshore in foreign currency, and such offering does not include any type of marketing or advertisement in Brazil. In view of that, when approaching clients in Brazil to market and sell securities, we usually recommend to adopt certain measures to mitigate the risk of having this interaction to be deemed as a irregular public offering in Brazil. So we do not recommend the use of mass media communication, such as internet, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and this type of thing. And we do not, for instance, recommend these materials to be translated into Portuguese. So you have, a proper evidence that you are targeting Brazilian investors. Contacts and interactions with clients in Brazil shall be made in one-on-one or small meetings, as opposed to large events or open events to several investors. And we also recommend including disclaimers in documents and materials, including emails that you want to deliver to Brazilian investors in order to make sure we are trying to keep that in a context of the safe harbor or even a private placement issuance here.
Just one comment on my side. I think Mariane has mentioned the situation where this entity wants to offer crypto that can be considered securities under Brazilian legislation, but it's not that situation. It's just an exchange of crypto, and it's not, by this activity being not considered the offering of securities, there is no risk in, at least at this point in time where the regulation is not enacted yet, in offering these services from abroad, as anyone can buy and sell crypto in whatever exchange then to use. So advertisement and trying to reach consumers in Brazil is open. Although, as explained, when we have the regulation enacted, this will depend on a prior authorization of the central bank.
Thank you for that. That's a very, very important point. And at Mattos Filho, as you are advising a lot of your customers and clients, and maybe even new customers and clients coming into the digital asset industry, what would you say are generally speaking, the most frequently asked questions or requests that you get from them in terms of understanding what do they need to do, when do they need to do it by, and how should they comply?
So one of them is exactly what we just approached here. Can I offer to the Brazilian market? If yes, what can I do, and to what extent it's possible to offer and not infringe the regulation? So I think the most important answers are focused on exactly what Mariane and I just explained. The other one is, can I incorporate in Brazil now and start offering crypto in Brazil, and what is going to happen if the regulation is enacted when I am in the process of incorporating, because it's a transition period. So it's up to develop a business model, and you need to change in a very short period of time because you don't know how the regulation is going to be. So normally advice is, well, maybe it would be interesting to keep offering from abroad wait for how the regulation is going to be. Then when it's going to enter into the Brazilian market, you'll be already adapted to the requirements and see if it is still an interesting country to exploit after the regulation is enacted. Another question that clients want to understand is if there is any waiver period after regulation is enacted, and there's this business model that I am used to develop with my own control, so on and so forth. What is going to happen? Should I need to, turn the page in 24 hours? And this is something that is foreseen in the law, where the central bank, when regulating the ASPs, is obliged to respect at least a 6-month period for companies to adapt the new regulation, but it can be extended. So it's something that it's going to take time from the scenario that we are now and the desired scenario, regulated scenario, because the regulator will need to respect, a minimum period of time for the companies to adequate their own business and offer crypto in a way that is adequate to the law.
Yeah, and I think that, thank you for that, because I think that's very consistent and congruent with other regulations on other jurisdictions we've seen. For example, in the European Union, even though MiCA comes into law at the 30th of December this year, companies have until July, I think, 2025 to become crypto CASPs with their local regulator. And we've already seen certain companies in France, for example, already shutting up because they've already been there for a number of years, but they know they won't be able to comply with the laws of the AMF, which is the French regulator in France, under the jurisdiction of MiCA. We're seeing similar things, for example, in Turkey, where you had to be able to apply initially by, I think, the 2nd of August, and you have this 6-month period. When if you can then comply with that in the first 6-month period, you'll have grandfather rights before the secondary regulation comes out as well. But then with secondary regulation, those dates could change. Plus, also there will be a time period when you can be allowed to adapt to the secondary regulation as well, or maybe pull out of the market. So as I said earlier, I think we're seeing a nice homogeneity of global regulations becoming, quite adept now at formulating, what is a global movement of assets, which is, distributed ledger technology and crypto assets as well. So maybe I could then move to the last question for today, is that I know we've been really talking about Brazil, but Brazil is one of a small number of Latin American countries that has taken a truly progressive approach to digital asset or crypto regulation. Do you see this changing as Brazil's progress with its legislative program, such that it could become that blueprint for other countries in the Latin American region?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. We have different examples in Latin America involving the crypto environment. You have situations such as El Salvador, where they have adopted Bitcoin as official currency, which is something very unusual, to say the least, but it was in 2022 and it keeps going. We have countries such as Argentina, where because their constant financial crisis and situation, crypto has become an important tool for consumers. And there's a lot of innovation there with products and services involving crypto and exchange of fiat, and the way they can try to deviate from the devaluation of their own currency. So it's something that the government is not restricting the way it's being provided there because of their need of this flexibility. We have another example, which is Paraguay. That is a non-regulated country, but what attracts in Paraguay is a different aspect, which is the low cost of energy, and then the market that is being developed there is crypto mining. So there are a lot of, entities going there just to mining crypto and then use that to fund other countries and other markets with the crypto that is being mined there. So there are different ways of seeing how crypto is being exploited in the markets in South America. I think that Brazil, as we always see in different markets, Brazil is always a country of reference because of the size of its market. And it's common to see, not since the first moment, but the market is exploited in Brazil. There's a lot of opportunities, and then the regulator comes. When the regulator comes, entities that are better structured, they face the regulation, they comply with regulation, and they know that's a good market to exploit. So Brazil is going to be the blueprint of other countries in South America. I think that will depend on the size of the market. It will depend on how these countries see Brazil as an example of how they intend. It's interesting to regulate in the same manner, because the answer is not one size fits all. I think we're going to see different ways of regulating crypto in South America.
I agree. And I think our regulator is raising the bar, Stuart, which I think is important for this market as well in Brazil. So now we're going to have service providers that comply with all this regulation, and then the new one that is going to be enacted by the Brazilian Central Bank. And this is going to be good for the market. We are very optimistic about that.
Yes, and we are too. We're definitely seeing a huge amount of interest from institutions who want to build up very robust offerings, not just to retail, but also to institutional customers across, not just the sell side, but also the buy side as well. So I think we're all looking forward to a very vibrant and positive future for digital asset and crypto adoption in Brazil. And upon that note, Mariane and Paulo, I really appreciate the comprehensive insights that you've both provided today to our audience. And I'm sure that they have really resonated with institutions when considering entering into the regulated digital asset market in Brazil. So a big thanks to both of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to support our podcast series. Now, we have really received a great number of reviews on our podcast, and the engagement level keeps going up and up. So thank you to everyone for joining us for the first time, who is joining us for the first time, that is. And thank you to our existing listeners for coming back. As we now head towards the latter part of 2024, we actually have a great lineup of guests and exciting podcasts to release over the next few months. So please come back and attend the next one, and also let your network know of the Gspröch so we can continue to increase our audience. So upon that, thank you for everyone for attending today, and looking forward to engaging with everyone on the next one. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you very much, Mariane.